Who truly ruled the history of Europe? Was there a bloodline hidden from the records? Mary Magdalene, not just a saint but carrying the trace of a mother? The symbols in Father Sauniere's church? Mere coincidence or a secret code? And Pierre Plantard's documents, were they writing history or staging a grand deception? The answers remain in the shadows. But the clues, they lead us closer. Ready? Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and together, let's unlock the door to the mystery, the shadowed line and enigmatic documents. In the quiet corners of history where the parchment is yellowed and the ink has faded to a whisper, there exist stories that refuse to die. Among these, few are as unsettling as the tale of the Merovingian bloodline, a lineage that, if the fragments of truth are sewn together carefully, could rewrite the story of European history. The first traces of this shadowed line do not appear in grand chronicles or celebrated histories. They appear in footnotes, in esoteric manuscripts, in the obscure folds of the Priory of Sion. The Priory itself is shrouded in ambiguity. Founded, some say, in the aftermath of the Crusades, it was supposedly a secret society dedicated to preserving knowledge, sacred, forbidden, dangerous knowledge. Its documents, known as the Dossiers of Sion, were smuggled into the 20th century through a web of mystics, forgers, and dreamers. Among the names that haunt these texts, Pierre Plantard looms large, a man who stitched together fact and fiction with a deft hand, presenting the Priory not as myth, but as an operating secret buried within European history. The early pages of the dossier hint at a lineage older than the Carolingians, older even than the Merovingians, a bloodline whose legitimacy did not rely on papal approval or sword, but on something far older, sanctity in the veins themselves. The Merovingians, it suggests, were no ordinary kings. Their authority was whispered to be divine, encoded not in law or ceremony, but in blood. The suggestion is incendiary. A secret kingly lineage, preserved against all odds, protected by alliances and silence. A lineage that could claim a different form of divine right than Rome itself had ever sanctioned. As the story unfolds, one begins to notice the peculiar meticulousness of the dossier's authors. They did not merely record the Merovingians' existence, they cross-referenced scattered apocryphal gospels, Gnostic texts, and medieval legends. Every chronicle, every obscure manuscript, every half-forgotten relic was treated as a piece of a puzzle. The effect is both hypnotic and disturbing. Suddenly a tapestry of European history appears, stitched together not by kings and popes, but by secret guardians, hidden heirs, and the persistent shadow of a line of blood that dared not speak its own name. It was in this context that the modern fascination began. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the 1982 publication by Behringer, Lee, and Lincoln, took the raw, unsettling threads of the Priory and wove them into a narrative accessible to the public. Unlike standard history books, it treated rumor and legend not as entertainment, but as evidence. It posited, with carefully measured audacity, that the Holy Grail was not a cup, not an object to be sought on distant quests, but a bloodline, a sacred lineage, preserved, guarded, and crucially hidden. The Merovingians were central, not a footnote, not a relic of forgotten rule, but the embodiment of a heretical truth. The reaction was explosive. Scholars accused the authors of fabrication, of selective interpretation, and of dangerous speculation. The Church predictably bristled, labeling the claims heretical. And yet the book did something remarkable. It planted a seed. Even among skeptics, a question lingered, a tiny tremor of doubt that something in this shadowed history might actually be true. Dusty archives were re-examined, long-forgotten letters brought to light, and obscure genealogies combed for clues. Tourists flocked to churches in southern France once again, not for the architecture, but for the secrets that might be concealed within stone. Central to the narrative, and the aspect that captured the imagination most profoundly, was Mary Magdalene. Traditionally, she had been painted alternately as sinner, saint, and disciple. Yet in the context of the Merovingian story, Magdalene becomes far more than these simplified roles. She is the vessel of continuity, the carrier of sacred blood. According to the theory, she bore Jesus' child and fled across the Mediterranean to what is now southern France. There, among the rocky cliffs and hidden valleys of Provence, she and her child were absorbed into noble society, protected by families whose allegiance was quiet, yet unbroken. This child, half divine, half mortal, grew up amid secrecy and silent reverence. The Merovingian line did not merely survive, it flourished in hidden branches, weaving itself into European nobility, leaving only subtle marks, a carefully chosen marriage, a line of succession that disappeared into obscurity, symbols carved into stone that seemed innocuous to the untrained eye. Every fleur-de-lis, every bee, every peculiar cross in stained glass is interpreted by modern theorists as a whisper of bloodline continuity, a hidden language for those who know how to read it. It is here that the narrative grows darker and more compelling. The rise of the Carolingians, the deposition of Childeric III, the exile to monasteries, the ceremonial cutting of the sacred long hair, all are reframed not as historical footnotes, but as deliberate acts of erasure. Power was not merely political, it was theological, and the Church, acting as both arbiter and protector, sought to contain a lineage it could not destroy outright. The Merovingians were not eliminated, they were hidden, scattered, folded into new houses, their blood diluted yet preserved, their symbols embedded in architecture, in art, in heraldry. The patterns emerged slowly but unmistakably. Obscure families in southern France, northern Italy, and Bavaria carry heraldic emblems that hint at continuity: gold bees, 8-pointed stars, and vines twisted into impossible configurations. Monastic archives preserve obscure references to individuals whose names resemble lost Merovingian princes and princesses. And always, the underlying suggestion remains: if the bloodline is sacred, if it carries divinity itself, it cannot be eradicated entirely. It must be preserved, and preserved it was. Even as the 20th century dawned, the threads persisted. Hidden estates, long-forgotten properties, and small villages in Provence quietly nurtured the secret. Priests like Behringer Sonier of Rennes-le-Château inherited crumbling churches but transformed them into coded shrines filled with symbolism, frescoes, and puzzles. Their behavior seemed eccentric, even inexplicable, but in retrospect, it reads as guardianship, a quiet defense of a lineage too dangerous to acknowledge openly. And so Chapter 1 closes not with revelation, but with anticipation. The Merovingian bloodline is introduced not merely as a relic of history, but as a living, breathing mystery. The priory, the documents, the symbols, the churches, and the forgotten manuscripts all converge to suggest a secret far older than kings, older than empires, older than doctrine itself. It is a line of blood that defies erasure, a narrative that refuses closure, and a history that demands attention from those who dare look closely enough to notice the pattern. In the following chapters, the journey continues. We will explore the child of Mary Magdalene, the secret integration into noble society, the symbols that marked allegiance, and the guardians who ensured survival. Each layer reveals another piece of a hidden puzzle, and as the story unfolds, the boundaries between myth and reality begin to blur. The shadows of history are long, and the line of Merovingian kings stretches farther than anyone has imagined. Mary Magdalene and the Merovingian line. The whispers of history grow louder when they speak of Mary Magdalene, a woman whose life has been endlessly interpreted, rewritten, and often suppressed. She appears in canonical Gospels as a devoted follower of Jesus, yet in apocryphal writings, her presence is charged with authority and intimacy. In the Gospel of Philip, she is referred to as Jesus' companion. In Aramaic, the term could suggest more than discipleship. It could imply marriage. In the Gospel of Mary, she receives visions denied to the male apostles, and Peter's jealousy hints at a tension that would ripple through centuries of church history. The theory is deceptively simple yet explosive. Mary Magdalene was not only a follower of Christ, but his spouse. She bore his child, perhaps more than one, and fled to protect that child after the crucifixion. This child, the hypothetical scion of divine and mortal blood, became the vessel of what would later be called the Merovingian lineage. It is a claim that reverberates through legend, echoing in medieval frescoes, obscure manuscripts, and oral traditions in the hidden valleys of southern France. The journey to Provence is central to the story. Some traditions say Mary landed by boat on the rocky coast, accompanied by a small group of followers. She was not fleeing out of despair alone, but out of purpose. The child she carried was a secret too profound to reveal publicly. In a world where the Church exercised authority through orthodoxy, any claim to divine lineage outside Rome's sanction was dangerous. She sought sanctuary among the rural, tribal, and nascent noble communities of Gaul, where her arrival would eventually leave an imprint on both blood and story. Local folklore preserves fragments of her presence. In small chapels and grottos, her image appears not as a penitent sinner, but as a noble woman cradling a child, often depicted with red hair. A subtle marker of distinction in art otherwise dominated by canonical conventions. She is said to have baptized, taught, and even healed, leaving traces in ritual and memory that endured long after her departure. These legends, preserved in both word and symbol, provide the first threads of the Merovingian tapestry, where sacred lineage and nobility intertwine. The child, raised in secret, absorbed the customs and rituals of the region's nobility. Concealed under the care of loyal families, he was taught Latin, horsemanship, and the rituals of courtly life, all while being reminded of a heritage never to be spoken aloud. This dual existence, noble by adoption, sacred by inheritance, would become a defining feature of the Merovingians. Their legitimacy was not granted by coronation nor acknowledged by the Church, yet it was preserved quietly and meticulously through careful alliances and the subtle reinforcement of symbols. The connection between divine blood and rulership is central to understanding why secrecy was paramount. In the medieval imagination, kings were often considered God's representatives on earth, their right to rule sanctioned by divine favor. For the Merovingians, this divine sanction was literal. It flowed through veins rather than proclamations. Every union, every marriage alliance, every act of guardianship became a careful measure to protect the sacred lineage, a quiet rebellion against the authority of Rome that was never openly declared. Symbols, as always, marked the continuity of this hidden line. The bee, for example, appeared repeatedly in Merovingian iconography, representing resurrection, divine kingship, and eternal life. It is preserved in the tombs of early Merovingian rulers and later adopted subtly by families claiming clandestine ties to the line. The fleur-de-lis, too, may serve a double purpose: public representation of purity or sovereignty, and a coded reference to the convergence of three sacred lines: the child of Magdalene, the local nobility, and the protectors who ensured survival. The Merovingian child, often obscured in historical record, was raised in a liminal space, invisible enough to assume noble roles, invisible enough to escape the scrutiny of Rome. This careful cultivation ensured that the bloodline persisted, not openly, but woven into the fabric of society. By the 6th century, descendants were assimilated into minor noble houses, their origins whispered only in private gatherings, and preserved in manuscripts that would survive monastic purges. Their names were altered, their estates reassigned, yet traces remained, encoded in heraldry, ritual, and the enduring fascination of local myth. As centuries passed, the line intertwined with the ruling elite. Marriages were arranged discreetly, alliances forged with families who understood the weight of secrecy. The Church, often pragmatic, sanctioned rulership through papal decree, but the Merovingians, even in obscurity, retained an aura of the sacred. Their legitimacy, invisible to the chronicler, was preserved through a network of allies and guardians who had understood, for generations, the true nature of their charge. The narrative of Mary Magdalene's child is also reinforced by a peculiar pattern in art and architecture. In southern France, small chapels display symbols too precise to be coincidental: red-heighted figures, unusual placement of crosses, inscriptions in cryptic Latin. Even the construction of towers, gardens, and pathways sometimes follows patterns of sacred geometry, mirroring celestial or theological principles. These arrangements are not random, they are deliberate, a visual language meant to communicate across centuries, signaling the presence of a sacred bloodline hidden in plain sight. The persistence of the lineage created tensions between visibility and secrecy. Too public a display risked annihilation, too obscure a preservation risked being forgotten. Families that carried the Merovingian blood were forced to balance ambition with discretion. Some entered the clergy, embedding themselves in institutions that could provide both cover and influence. Others married into merchant or banking families, leveraging wealth and status to maintain protection. And always, there was the network of guardians, the shadowed intermediaries who moved resources, advised marriages, and ensured that no branch of the line was ever truly extinguished. This delicate balance also explains why certain noble symbols recur in unexpected places. The bee, the eight-pointed star, or the unique arrangement of a fleur-de-lis does more than adorn a shield. It signals a silent continuity, a subtle claim of lineage, a private assertion of sacred right. In the hands of those who understood, these symbols were legible. To the uninformed, they were merely decorative. Across generations, these visual codes stitched a hidden continuity, linking disparate families into an invisible web, anchored by the bloodline of Magdalene's child. By the end of the chapter, the reader begins to appreciate the complexity of secrecy. Mary Magdalene's child, once hidden in exile, becomes the nucleus of a lineage that traverses centuries, entwining with nobility, clergy, and guardians alike. The line is protected, dispersed, and woven into the social, religious, and political fabric of Europe. The theory challenges the conventional history of kings and popes, suggesting that sacred authority may have flowed through hidden veins, parallel to, and occasionally in tension with, the established church. In this way, Chapter 2 sets the stage for the enduring mystery of the Merovingian bloodline. The child of Mary Magdalene is no longer merely a figure of speculation. He is the first link in a chain that will ripple through Europe, leaving traces in heraldry, sacred sites, and secret records. And as the chapters progress, the story will follow the guardians, the hidden alliances, and the subtle symbols that ensure the survival of this sacred line, all while history appeared to march forward, oblivious to the shadowed lineage coursing beneath its surface. The Merovingian royal secrets. Medieval Europe remembers the Merovingians, the long-ailed kings, as the earliest dynastic rulers of the Frankish realm. But hidden in the folds of legend and fragmentary chronicles is a deeper story. The Merovingians, their sacred bloodline, and the rituals that bound their right to rule to something far older than a throne or a crown. In the forests and river valleys of Gaul, the long hair of these kings was more than ornament. It was an emblem of divine favor, a visible thread connecting mortal rulers to a sacred ancestry. Every lock, every braid, carried weight. To cut it without ritual was to sever a line of celestial legitimacy. The rise of the Carolingians, beginning with Pepin the Short, altered this delicate equilibrium. The last Merovingian king, Childerin III, was dethroned not through war, but ceremony. His hair was shorn, a symbolic act echoing the biblical Samson, while the church offered its blessing to the new ruler. In public, it appeared as a pragmatic endorsement of political reality. In private, it was an act of containment. To sever the sacred hair was to sever the visible proof of divine lineage, rendering the Merovingians obsolete in the official historical record. Yet the bloodline did not vanish. It went underground, preserved quietly in minor noble houses, monasteries, and discreet estates, its influence hidden beneath layers of feudal allegiance. Evidence of this hidden lineage appears sporadically, like fragments of a puzzle scattered across centuries. Charters, letters, and genealogies hint at connections that official annals deliberately obscure. A daughter of Dagobert II, for instance, is whispered to have married into the Guillemid family of Aquitaine, a rising noble house in the 9th century. The records are never explicit, names shift, and dates are approximate, but the pattern is unmistakable. Across France, Germany, and northern Italy, similar threads appear. Families adopt unusual heraldry, peculiar symbols or ritual practices that echo the Merovingian legacy. A bee here, a twisted vine there, stars and crosses arranged with subtle precision, markers that only a few would recognize as declarations of blood and loyalty. The preservation of these lines relied not solely on secrecy, but on guardianship. The Church controlled much of the written record and the estates of exiled royals, yet its oversight was imperfect. Some monasteries inadvertently became havens, holding documents, seals, and liturgical artifacts linked to the Merovingians. Within these walls, friars and abbots preserved the lineage's memory, sometimes knowingly, sometimes simply through oversight. Families understood that marriage into ecclesiastical influence offered both cover and protection. Children raised in relative obscurity were subtly instructed in the legacy of their blood, their lessons in Latin, ritual, and heraldry, doubling as a secret curriculum designed to preserve their sacred identity. The sacred nature of Merovingian authority extended beyond symbols and blood. The kings were believed to possess an aura, an ineffable charisma that lent legitimacy to their governance. Chroniclers of the period often remarked upon their otherworldly presence and miraculous deeds, even as official records sought to minimize their influence. These anecdotes, dismissed as legend by some, may in fact preserve a memory of rulers whose authority was as much spiritual as political. By the time the Carolingians assumed power, these elements were deliberately excised or obscured, leaving a skeletal history of kings who seemed unremarkable when in truth they had carried a sacred line for generations. Secret property holdings further safeguarded the lineage. Merovingian estates, lands gifted by local nobility or inherited quietly, were often managed in ways that concealed the identity of their true heirs. Letters, account books, and feudal contracts survive in fragments, occasionally revealing cryptic annotations, references to the hidden heir, the sacred vine, or the blood not yet acknowledged. Scholars have long debated these phrases, some dismissing them as poetic metaphor. Yet when examined alongside heraldic evidence, oral tradition, and the occasional ecclesiastical record, a pattern emerges that suggests deliberate protection of a bloodline, rather than mere literary flourish. This intricate network of guardianship may explain the survival of the lineage into later centuries. The Merovingians did not vanish entirely, they adapted. Members of the family assumed new surnames, married into rising noble houses, or entered ecclesiastical positions where their presence could remain discreet. They became bankers, scholars, and advisors, their sacred heritage concealed behind the veneer of ordinary titles. And yet certain symbols persisted, encoded into family crests, coats of arms, and private rituals. Bees, fleur-de-lis, and subtle geometric arrangements became silent signatures, asserting identity in a world where vocal claims would have been deadly. It is here that the Templars enter the story, bridging the gap between sacred blood and militant guardianship. Founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims, the Order of the Temple of Solomon gradually became a formidable financial and military network. According to some theorists, their mission extended beyond the Holy Land. They may have served as custodians of the Merovingian line, moving heirs discreetly across Europe, safeguarding relics and preserving coded documents. The abrupt suppression of the Templars in 1307, arrested, tortured, and executed under charges of heresy, can be read not merely as political maneuvering by King Philip IV, but as the strategic removal of a protective network. The documents they carried vanished, but traces lingered. Cryptic symbols in Templar chapels, unusual arrangements in their heraldry, and local traditions hinting at their role as protectors of secret lineage rather than heretics of faith. Some manuscripts and letters hint at more direct interventions. Monastic archives occasionally contain references to the children of the sacred line or those watched by the brothers. The language is deliberately vague, but the context aligns with the theory of guardianship. Through these intermediaries, Merovingian heirs could be hidden in monasteries, minor estates, or even foreign courts. Families understood the necessity of discretion. To expose their claim was to invite annihilation, yet to forget it entirely was to sever the continuity of sacred authority. The balance between secrecy and survival became the defining characteristic of the lineage. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Merovingian bloodline had dispersed across Europe, a web of discreetly connected families bearing fragments of sacred identity. Even without formal recognition, the bloodline exerted influence through strategic marriages, advisory roles in courts, and quiet stewardship of estates. Symbols persisted, subtle enough to evade casual notice, but deliberate enough to preserve continuity. Bees, fleur-de-lis, eight-pointed stars, and serpentine motifs appeared repeatedly in heraldic devices. Some historians argue coincidence, others detect a deliberate pattern, a coded signal of allegiance and heritage. The significance of these symbols cannot be overstated. In a largely illiterate society, visual codes carried meaning, often substituting for written records that could be destroyed or censored. They encoded knowledge, declared loyalty, and protected identity. To those who understood, they were as legible as any document. To outsiders, they were ornament. In this way, the Merovingian lineage survived, hidden in plain sight, entwined with the emerging European nobility, yet never fully acknowledged by the official history that chronicled kings and popes. Chapter 3 concludes with the realization that the Merovingians were never truly erased. They were reconstituted, absorbed, and protected through layers of secrecy. Their survival depended on symbols, guardianship, and careful alliances. Their story is not one of overt power, but of subtle endurance. The long-haired kings, once visible and revered, became invisible custodians, their sacred line woven into the veins of Europe's noble houses, waiting for the moment when history might notice them again. Symbols and traces. Europe's history is written not only in chronicles and charters, but in symbols, colors, and subtle arrangements that often escape the casual eye. For those seeking the hidden Merovingian line, these symbols were more than decoration. They were declarations, secret markers of identity, continuity, and allegiance. The long-haired kings, once visible and unmistakable, had left traces in heraldry, church iconography, and the rituals of families who survived the tides of political change. Symbols became a language, unspoken yet eloquent, speaking to those who could read them and concealing meaning from those who could not. The bee, chief among Merovingian symbols, recurs across centuries with a consistency that defies coincidence. In tombs, on rings, and in illuminated manuscripts, the bee represented resurrection, eternal life, and divine kingship. When 300 golden bees were discovered in the tomb of Childred, the furthest remembered Merovingian ancestor, historians debated their significance. To the uninitiated, they were ornament. To those who understood, they were a message, encoded in metal and gold. The bloodline endured. Later, Napoleon would adopt the bee as a deliberate symbol of continuity, linking his reign not to the Bourbons, but to a lineage older, sacred, and perhaps obscured. Equally significant was the fleur-de-lis, ubiquitous in French heraldry and national imagery. Officially, it symbolized purity and divine favor, but esoteric theorists suggest a deeper code: 3 converging lines, 3 branches, hinting at hidden bloodlines and the sacred ancestry of rulers. Traces of these symbols appear repeatedly in Merovingian sites, Templar engravings, and noble heraldry, suggesting deliberate preservation across generations. In southern France and northern Italy, historians and amateur researchers alike have noted recurring motifs: 8-pointed stars beneath crowns, lions with forked tails, vines twisted into unusual patterns. They are small, almost imperceptible, yet remarkably consistent, suggesting not mere aesthetic choice, but intentional communication. Family crests and coats of arms often conceal more than lineage, they encode memory. Families with supposed links to the Merovingians incorporated bees, stars, and subtle geometric arrangements into their heraldry, preserving knowledge of sacred descent without drawing overt attention. A diagonal line across a shield might represent an ancestral branch, not a territorial claim. Colors were chosen not only for aesthetic appeal, but for coded significance: crimson to denote sanctity or sacrifice, gold to represent divine favor, and green for continuity or growth. Symbols were layered in a hierarchy visible only to those trained to understand them. This language of imagery extended to ecclesiastical art and architecture. Medieval churches, chapels, and monasteries are filled with hints: statues of women positioned prominently despite seeming irrelevance, stained glass windows with a single red-hailed figure amidst apostles, altarpieces omitting certain conventional elements. Scholars have often dismissed these anomalies as artistic variation, but their repetition across multiple sites, particularly those with known Merovingian connections, suggests a deliberate pattern. Carvings of twin roses, cryptic Latin inscriptions, and abstract floral motifs appear repeatedly in Templar commanderies, suggesting a link between militant orders and sacred lineage. These symbols were not decorative, they were survival tools, encoding a narrative that could be destroyed in written form but persisted visually. Monastic records and church registers also contain gaps that hint at intentional erasure. Feudal transactions, baptismal registers, and death records often omit crucial details or contain abrupt interruptions, particularly concerning estates formerly associated with Merovingian descendants. While mainstream historians cite clerical error or loss, the consistency of these gaps, particularly in regions associated with early Merovingian holdings, fuels speculation that knowledge of bloodline continuity was deliberately protected. Certain abbeys preserved subtle clues in marginalia: a bee drawn beside a ledger entry, a star etched faintly into parchment, or a seemingly random name repeated across documents, hinting at clandestine guardianship. Researchers in the modern era have cataloged these symbols extensively. Field studies in southern France, northern Italy, and southwestern Germany reveal an almost obsessive repetition of motifs among noble families: bees, fleur-de-lis, roses, intertwined vines, and eight-pointed stars. Maps overlaying historical Templar routes with Merovingian estates suggest alignment not only of geography, but of symbolic placement. In some cases, churches restored or modified by known Merovingian descendants or their allies contain intentional geometric arrangements, pathways, gardens, and interior alignments corresponding to sacred geometry. The meticulous attention to orientation and proportion suggests a deliberate attempt to encode information beyond the visual, an esoteric message designed to survive centuries of scrutiny. The intentionality behind these symbols is reinforced when combined with legends and oral traditions. Locals in villages with Merovingian associations often recount stories of hidden chambers, crypts sealed with wax, and monks wandering under moonlight carrying mysterious objects. These tales, while often dismissed as folklore, are unusually consistent across multiple regions and centuries, suggesting preservation of secret knowledge. Even subtle practices such as ceremonial placement of candles, the design of floral arrangements, or the directionality of religious processions may encode messages tied to bloodline awareness. The connection between symbols and ritual guardianship is particularly evident in family practices. Certain noble households maintained private ceremonies, sometimes disguised as ordinary seasonal festivities, that honored ancestors, preserved knowledge of lineage, or reinforced the sacred nature of descent. The repetition of these rituals, sometimes for centuries, suggests a conscious effort to maintain identity and continuity. Each generation passed down both material artifacts and symbolic literacy, the ability to interpret heraldic markers, ecclesiastical carvings, or cryptic inscriptions, ensuring that knowledge of the bloodline survived even when overt acknowledgement was impossible. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries, the thread of symbolic preservation persisted. Figures like Baron Sonier, who transformed the church at Rennes-le-Château, relied heavily on visual cues to encode knowledge of Merovingian heritage. Frescoes, statues, gardens, and inscriptions were all arranged with intent, creating a physical and symbolic archive accessible only to those who knew the code. Modern researchers, including Gerard Deed, have traced these connections, noting striking parallels between Sonier's renovations and the symbols historically associated with Merovingian sites and Templar holdings. Ultimately, the chapter of Symbols and Traces reveals a persistent theme. The Merovingian bloodline survived not merely through genetics, but through coded culture. Heraldry, art, ritual, and architecture became the vessels for preservation. allowing knowledge to endure even when political and religious authorities sought to suppress it. These traces, subtle yet deliberate, form a narrative that complements genealogical research, oral tradition, and historical analysis. As one surveys the landscape of medieval Europe, the symbols emerge as a silent chorus, speaking to the endurance of a line deemed too sacred, too potent, or too dangerous to allow public acknowledgement. Bees, fleur-de-lis, roses, stars, and serpentine motifs are not relics of design. They are declarations of survival, continuity, and concealed authority. They encode a story that written records cannot fully capture, connecting generations across centuries and offering a path for those willing to see what has always been hidden: the Templars and the secret guardianship. The early 12th century witnessed the birth of an organization that would become legendary, controversial, and mysterious in ways that still echo today: the Order of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Templars. Ostensibly founded to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the order rapidly evolved into something far greater: an autonomous military, financial, and some argue custodial institution with a secretive purpose that extended beyond the Crusades. In the early years, the Templars operated primarily in Jerusalem, safeguarding the paths between coastal cities and inland holy sites. Their distinctive white mantles emblazoned with a red cross made them immediately recognizable, but it was their discipline, secrecy, and organizational acumen that gave them unprecedented influence. Fortifications were constructed not only as defensive strongholds, but as centers of knowledge and storage. Within their walls, treasures, sacred relics, and perhaps hidden genealogical records were meticulously cataloged. Some historians argue that these early archives may have included information on the Merovingian bloodline, the lost descendants of a line believed to carry sacred heritage. The Templars' growing wealth and influence alarmed monarchs and church leaders alike. Across Europe, they operated with near-sovereign authority, building fortresses, establishing trade networks, and even developing banking practices that allowed nobles to deposit gold in one city and withdraw it elsewhere. To many, the Templars seemed invincible, a state within a state, but it is precisely this autonomy that fueled theories of secret guardianship. If the Merovingian bloodline had indeed survived in obscurity after the Carolingian consolidation, it would have required protection. And if the church or ruling dynasties had sought to suppress such knowledge, the Templars were uniquely positioned to act as custodians. They controlled fortified sites across France, Spain, Portugal, and the Holy Land, locations where descendants of Merovingian nobility could be sheltered. Ships disappeared from Mediterranean ports with unexplained cargo, lands were acquired quietly, cryptic records were maintained without drawing attention. To the outside observer, these were merely administrative functions. To those who believe in a sacred bloodline, they were acts of protection, carefully disguised. The legends of lost treasure emerged from this era, blending fact and rumor. Chroniclers wrote of gold, silver, sacred vessels, and religious relics being concealed in Templar strongholds. Yet among these stories, some whispered of items far more extraordinary: genealogical scrolls, parchments detailing secret marriages, documents proving descent from Christ, and perhaps artifacts linked to Mary Magdalene. If such items existed, their discovery would have undermined the Church's central claim to spiritual authority, which rested on apostolic succession rather than direct bloodline. In a world where the divine right of kings had been symbolically, if not literally, rooted in lineage, the stakes were enormous. The Templars' downfall in 1307 is usually attributed to the greed and ambition of King Philip IV of France, who was heavily indebted to the order. Philip pressured Pope Clement V to authorize mass arrests, and on Friday the 13th, hundreds of Templar knights were seized. They faced charges of heresy, sodomy, and sacrilege, though many historians agree these accusations were politically motivated and largely fabricated. Leaders were tortured into confessions, many executed by fire, and their properties were confiscated. Yet amidst the chaos, a number of Templars vanished without a trace, including high-ranking officials, treasurers, and master knights. Where did they go? Theories abound. Some claim they sailed to Scotland, protected by sympathetic nobility, Others point to Portugal, where the Order of Christ purportedly absorbed Templar resources and knowledge. But a quieter trail leads back to southern France, the very region where Mary Magdalene's legend had taken root and where Merovingian traces lingered. Here, Templar commanderies, estates, and churches bear subtle symbols: bees, eight-pointed stars, intertwined vines, and cryptic inscriptions. These motifs, found repeatedly in Merovingian heraldry and ecclesiastical sites, suggest a deliberate continuity, as if the Templars were tasked not just with protecting pilgrims or holy sites, but a lineage. Among the missing was Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. He was executed in 1314 atop a Parisian scaffold, purportedly cursing both king and pope with his final words. Yet even with his death, whispers persisted that other knights had escaped with treasures, documents, or knowledge too dangerous to reveal. Some became itinerant guardians, relocating descendants of sacred lines from monastery to manor, from chateau to hidden estate. Others may have embedded themselves within secretive orders that survived into later centuries. The Rosicrucians, early Freemasons, and various esoteric groups claimed or were believed to carry fragments of Templar tradition forward. The Templars' meticulous attention to architecture and sacred geometry reinforces the theory of deliberate preservation. Crypts, altars, and chapels constructed by Templars are aligned with celestial events or cardinal directions, creating spaces that are simultaneously functional, symbolic, and encoded with knowledge. Gardens, pathways, and fresco arrangements were carefully planned. Inscriptions often employ wordplay, puns, and multi-layered Latin that may hide names, dates, or genealogical clues. A casual visitor might see only artistry. A trained eye might discern a map of legacy, a record of descent, or even a hidden message regarding the guardianship of the bloodline. Some suggest that the Templars were not heretics in the traditional sense. They did not defy Rome to worship demons or enact blasphemy. Instead, they may have upheld a suppressed truth, a gospel that included Mary Magdalene, a child born in exile, and a line of descendants considered sacred. If this were true, their perceived heresy was an act of loyalty to a lineage and legacy rather than a rejection of the Church. Their sudden, violent suppression then appears less as justice and more as containment, a decisive effort to remove a dangerous narrative from the historical record. Even centuries later, the remnants of this mission are detectable in subtle ways. Symbols in French and Spanish Templar commanderies correspond almost precisely to those found in Merovingian-linked estates: twin roses, bees, stars, vines, serpents. These motifs, while not identical, share proportions, placement, and orientation that strongly suggest intentional transmission. Whether these are echoes of an actual bloodline, symbolic allegiances, or purely esoteric exercises, the pattern is unmistakable. Thus, the Templars emerged not merely as warriors of Christendom, but as keepers of a lineage, defenders of a secret that transcended temporal power. Their fall was dramatic, their records partially destroyed, yet fragments survived, encrypted in art, architecture, heraldry, and rumor, and these fragments have continued to guide historians, treasure hunters, and seekers of forbidden knowledge who trace them from medieval Europe to modern-day villages like Rennes-le-Château. The narrative of the Templars intertwined with the Merovingians reveals a central theme. The survival of sacred knowledge often relies on secrecy, discipline, and symbolic literacy. Objects, gestures, and patterns endure when words fail. A monk in a monastery, a knight in exile, a priest restoring a chapel centuries later, all may act as custodians, ensuring continuity through subtle intervention rather than public declaration. In this sense, the Templars did not vanish. They adapted, dispersed, and became invisible conduits of a story that could not yet be told aloud. And so, as one contemplates the fall of the Templars, the mysterious deaths, disappearances, and confiscations, it is not merely a tale of political intrigue or ecclesiastical overreach. It is a story of guardianship, of lineage protected by silence and symbolism, and of a mission whose consequences ripple centuries into the future. If the bloodline truly survived, if the Merovingian descendants were quietly safeguarded, then the Templars' legacy is not lost. It is woven invisibly into the fabric of history, waiting for those who know how to read it. Rennes-le-Château and Behringer Sonier. Nestled within the rolling hills of southern France lies the village of Rennes-le-Château, a place so unassuming that a passerby might never suspect the deep currents of history flowing beneath its cobbled streets. With fewer than 100 residents at the turn of the 20th century, the village appeared little more than a sleepy hamlet. Yet its modest church, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, would become the epicenter of a mystery reaching back centuries, entwined with the Merovingian bloodline, the Templars, and a priest whose life defied both explanation and expectation. The priest in question, Father Saunière, arrived in Rennes-le-Château in 1885, inheriting a church that was both dilapidated and overlooked. Its frescoes were faded, its statues crumbling, and the sacred spaces neglected. For the locals, Saunier's appointment seemed unremarkable. For the ecclesiastical authorities, he was just another rural curate. Yet it soon became apparent that Sonier was anything but ordinary. Within a few years, the modest chapel had been transformed. Frescoes were painstakingly restored, grotesque and cryptic statues appeared along its walls, and the grounds were landscaped with gardens, pathways, and towers that seemed almost ritualistic in design. What fueled this transformation was the source of Saunier's sudden wealth. For a rural priest with a modest stipend, the influx of funds was inexplicable. Rumors began to circulate immediately. Some claimed he had uncovered hidden treasure beneath the church. Others whispered of secret documents, perhaps proving the survival of the Merovingian bloodline. Some suggested connections to Templar relics, lost gospels, or genealogical scrolls detailing descendants of Mary Magdalene. Whatever the truth, it changed everything about the village, transforming Rennes-le-Château into a place of intrigue and speculation. Saunier's restoration projects were anything but conventional. Every fresco, statue, and garden element appeared carefully placed, not only for aesthetic reasons but to encode messages, symbols, and perhaps knowledge. In the church, one fresco depicted the crucifixion, but with notable anomalies. Jesus' wounds seemed understated, almost absent, and a woman with vivid red hair was positioned prominently, an unusual choice for canonical iconography. Statues presented allegories and moral warnings, but some figures bore gestures or inscriptions that seemed cryptic, hinting at knowledge too profound to state outright. In the gardens, pathways were not random. They followed lines that aligned with celestial events, cardinal points, and possibly ancient pilgrimage routes. Stones were engraved with Latin phrases that could be rearranged to form hidden meanings. Above the church entrance, the phrase terribus was carved, a term that could mean awe-inspiring or terrible depending on interpretation. It is a subtle, almost playful warning. The place was more than a simple church. It was a repository, a coded shrine, a living map of secrecy. Throughout this period, Saunier exhibited an unwavering devotion not only to restoration, but to preserving secrecy. He refused promotion, defied directives from superiors, and constructed a personal library within a tower he named Tour Magdala, a clear reference to Mary Magdalene. This library housed manuscripts, books, and perhaps documents of greater significance, though what exactly it contained remains a mystery. When he died in 1917, his final confession reportedly left the attending priest in shock. Whatever Sonier revealed was deemed too dangerous to absolve. It is said that he took the core of his knowledge with him, or perhaps left it carefully hidden, encrypted within the architecture, gardens, and objects of the church. In the decades that followed, Rennes-le-Château became a magnet for treasure hunters, historians, and occultists. Some were drawn by tales of Visigothic gold, others by rumors of lost Templar treasures. Yet, increasingly, attention turned toward a more elusive possibility, that what Sonier discovered was not material wealth, but knowledge, proof of the Merovingian bloodline's survival, a lineage tracing back to Mary Magdalene and by extension, Christ himself. Modern researchers studying Rennes-le-Château have noted patterns that suggest deliberate encoding, alignments in architecture, garden layouts, and fresco placements that correspond to sacred geometry, Templar routes, medieval land grants, and even celestial events. Symbols appear throughout the church and grounds. Bees, stars, flowers, intertwined vines, and inscriptions in Latin that, when decoded, reference Magdalene, Jesus, and the Rex Mundi, a Gnostic figure representing hidden divine authority. The repetition of these symbols is too precise to be random, suggesting deliberate intent across generations. Even small details invite speculation. Carvings on altars, inscriptions in crypts, and the placement of statues seem designed to guide the observer toward a narrative hidden beneath the surface of conventional history. Local legends tell of monks walking at night, of sealed crypts, chests transported under moonlight, and secret passageways that may have once carried documents or descendants safely from one estate to another. These stories, often dismissed as folklore, take on a different weight when placed alongside the Merovingian and Templar connections. Skeptics argued that Sauniere's work was mere eccentricity or self-aggrandizement. Perhaps he was a fraud embellishing history to attract donations or attention. Yet there is a compelling argument that even frauds can point toward truths, whether consciously or unconsciously. Saunière never published, never sought fame, and operated quietly. His sudden access to wealth, his cryptic restorations, and his obsession with Mary Magdalene hint at a mission beyond simple aesthetics or clerical ambition. The symbolic language of Rennes-le-Château aligns closely with what has been observed in other Merovingian sites. Across southern France, noble estates, churches, and Templar commanderies share recurring motifs. Bees representing resurrection and divine kingship, 8-pointed stars denoting celestial alignment, intertwined vines suggesting genealogical continuity, and floral patterns potentially encoding branches of bloodlines. The repetition of these elements hints at an intentional network of visual codes, maintained over centuries to preserve knowledge invisible to the uninitiated. Bees in particular carry a weighty significance. The Merovingians, long before their disappearance from official records, were associated with bees as symbols of eternal life and sacred kingship. Some sources claim that 300 golden bees were found in the tomb of Childrich, a purported Merovingian ancestor, discovered in the 17th century. These symbols were adapted and modified by subsequent rulers, including Napoleon, who deliberately used the bee to signal continuity with a sacred line older than the Bourbons or Capetians. Sonier, knowingly or intuitively, seems to have tapped into this same semiotic tradition, using bees and other symbols to encode ancestral memory, lineage, and divine authority. Rennes-le-Château's story demonstrates how a place can become a guardian, not through walls or armies, but through symbols, memory, and meticulous curation. The village functions as a living archive, a repository of knowledge transmitted subtly across centuries. Saunier's interventions created a space where the Merovingian legacy, the Templar guardianship, and the Magdalene myth converged into a single coherent narrative, though one carefully hidden from public scrutiny. Even today, researchers, pilgrims, and curious visitors sense the weight of hidden histories. Paths, altars, gardens, and frescoes all invite interpretation, whispering of a story that was never officially acknowledged, but never fully erased. It is a silent inheritance, a lesson in preservation through secrecy, and a bridge between the medieval custodians and modern seekers. The narrative of Rennes-le-Château, anchored by Sonier, reveals a key truth. The survival of a bloodline, if sacred, relies not on proclamation, but on subtle guardianship, on layers of secrecy, art, and ritual that outlast individual lives. Sonier may have been the last in a line of modern custodians, a priest entrusted not with treasure, but with truth, encoded in architecture, symbols, and silent practice. And for those willing to read these signs, the village becomes more than a place. It is a map, a repository, and a guidepost, pointing toward a lineage that may still persist, quietly hidden in plain sight. Modern traces and myth-making. As the 20th century unfolded, the legend of the Merovingian bloodline began to take on new life in the modern imagination. No longer confined to obscure manuscripts, hidden crests, or the silent corridors of Rennes-le-Château, the story reached a broader audience through a series of researchers, historians, and writers who sought to uncover, preserve, and in some cases sensationalize the mysteries of the past. Among the earliest and most influential figures was Gerard Deed, whose 1960s work, Treasure of Rennes-le-Château, rekindled interest in the village, Behringer Sonier, and the potential survival of the Merovingian lineage. Dede's approach was meticulous yet accessible. He combined careful archival research with interviews of local villagers, cross-referencing oral traditions with extant church records and scattered documents from regional monasteries. His central thesis was simple but provocative. The Merovingian bloodline had not been extinguished but had persisted, hidden among minor noble houses, protected by discreet clergy, and guarded by secretive orders whose presence stretched across centuries. Dede traced connections between surviving heraldic symbols, private estates, and the cryptic iconography in churches and monasteries, arguing that these were not mere coincidences but deliberate markers of continuity. The book ignited curiosity in both scholarly and popular circles. Dede did not claim absolute proof. Instead, he presented patterns and possibilities, leaving room for interpretation while subtly insisting that the evidence, when pieced together, suggested more than mere legend. His writing captured the imagination of a generation, and Rennes-le-Château, previously overlooked by history, became a pilgrimage site for enthusiasts, historians, and treasure hunters alike. The village, with its faded frescoes, enigmatic statues, and hidden inscriptions, was suddenly a locus of potential discovery. As Dede's work circulated, it inevitably caught the attention of fiction writers seeking inspiration. Among them, Dan Brown would later bring the ideas of the Merovingian bloodline and Rennes-le-Château to a global audience in The Da Vinci Code. Brown, while crafting a narrative that was undeniably thrilling and heavily fictionalized, acknowledged Dede's research as a foundational source. He transformed Rennes-le-Château from a remote French village into a centerpiece of an international conspiracy thriller, embedding historical symbols, secret societies, and cryptic clues into a story consumed by millions. Brown's work demonstrates how myth-making and modern media amplify and distort historical speculation. Where Dede had carefully documented oral histories and archival fragments, Brown wove these threads into a tightly paced narrative designed to entertain, mystify, and provoke curiosity. The distinction between historical inquiry and literary imagination blurred, but the effect was profound. The Merovingian legend moved from the realm of academic marginalia into global consciousness. For many readers, the story became more than theory. It became a plausible hidden history of Europe, a narrative in which bloodlines, sacred relics, and secret guardians shaped the course of human events. This popularization had tangible effects. Scholars and enthusiasts revisited Rennes-le-Château, retracing Sonier's footsteps, examining frescoes, and decoding inscriptions. Historians debated the plausibility of the bloodline theory, some dismissing it outright as fanciful, others cautiously entertaining the possibility that secrets of the past could survive in symbols and lineages. Tourists, drawn by books and media coverage, arrived in the village with cameras and notebooks, eager to glimpse the lingering traces of a sacred and hidden history. The village economy, modest as it was, benefited from this attention, though few understood the deeper currents that had made Rennes-le-Château a focal point of centuries-long speculation. Alongside public fascination, the story inspired a network of independent researchers and amateur historians. They studied heraldic symbols, traced obscure genealogies, and examined patterns across Europe that could indicate the survival of Merovingian descendants. Their inquiries often centered on coats of arms, unusual marriages among minor noble houses, and the recurrence of symbolic motifs, bees, eight-pointed stars, intertwined vines, that suggested continuity with the medieval Merovingians. While the conclusions varied in rigor and plausibility, a consistent theme emerged. The legend persisted because the patterns, whether coincidental or deliberate, were remarkably consistent across centuries and regions. The narrative also engaged with the role of secret societies in preserving knowledge and lineage. Templar iconography, Masonic rituals, and Rosicrucian symbolism were examined for their possible connections to the Merovingian bloodline. Researchers debated whether these orders functioned as guardians, passing down information, protecting heirs, and encoding knowledge in ways that could survive the destruction of manuscripts, the erasure of tombs, and the suppression of dissenting histories. The idea was compelling. If the Merovingians held sacred knowledge or divine lineage, it would have required multi-layered protection, including clandestine networks that spanned centuries. Despite enthusiasm, the story remained controversial. The Church, while largely silent on modern claims, occasionally issued clarifications or disclaimers regarding historical interpretation. Mainstream historians question the reliability of sources, noting gaps, forgeries, and embellishments in genealogies and manuscripts. Skeptics emphasize that oral tradition, though fascinating, is prone to distortion, and symbols can be interpreted in multiple, sometimes conflicting ways. Yet the enduring fascination with the legend, its persistence across centuries, its repeated appearance in symbols, and its dramatic allure suggests that something significant, whether real or imagined, continues to capture the imagination. Modern scholarship has also examined the psychological and cultural dimensions of the legend. Stories of hidden bloodlines, secret guardians, and lost knowledge resonate deeply because they offer an alternative to official narratives, a sense of mystery and agency within history itself. The Merovingian legend provides a lens through which people can explore the tension between institutional authority and hidden truths, between recorded history and the fragments that survive in whispers, manuscripts, and symbols. Local culture in southern France has absorbed the legend in subtle ways. Festivals, folklore, and regional traditions often contain echoes of Mary Magdalene, Templar influence, or Merovingian symbolism. Even when framed as local color or historical curiosity, these elements keep the story alive, bridging the centuries between medieval custodians and modern observers. In Rennes-le-Château, the legend has become part of the landscape itself. A church, a garden, a tower, each a testament to the enduring fascination with secrets, sacred lineages, and the human desire to trace continuity in the face of historical erasure. Ultimately, Chapter 7 underscores the dual life of the Merovingian story. In private archives, family lore, and architectural symbols, it exists as a subtle, carefully protected history. In the public sphere, through books, media, and pop culture, it has become a legend, a thrilling narrative of hidden bloodlines, sacred relics, and secret societies. The boundary between fact and fiction is deliberately blurred, and that is precisely what gives the legend its enduring power. Rennes-le-Château, Behringer, Sonier, and the modern chroniclers like Deed illustrate how history and myth interact, creating a space where research, speculation, and storytelling converge. The village is more than a historical site. It is a living symbol of secrecy, preservation, and fascination. It reminds us that the past may not always be what it seems, and that legends often survive not because they are fully true, but because they contain threads of something profound that human memory refuses to let go. In the next chapter, the narrative will expand beyond Rennes-le-Château, tracing the Merovingian bloodline's supposed survival through European noble families, exploring heraldry, secret marriages, and subtle forms of continuity that may have persisted undetected for centuries. From cloistered monasteries to grand estates, from hidden archives to encoded symbols, the story of the bloodline continues, elusive yet persistent, whispering across history and into the modern world. European lineages and hidden bloodlines. As the Merovingian bloodline faded from the public stage, it did not vanish. It simply adapted. Its survival depended on subtlety, integration, and camouflage. Where once kings ruled openly, heirs of the bloodline now moved quietly into minor nobility, merging with families whose names carried no royal weight, but whose loyalty and discretion were assured. In doing so, the lineage maintained continuity, concealed in the folds of Europe's noble networks. The first clues of this quiet survival appear in genealogical records scattered across southern France, northern Italy, and parts of Germany. Monastic archives, often overlooked by mainstream historians, contain entries noting the marriages of obscure daughters of exiled nobility to rising minor houses. Dates, places, and familial ties match too neatly with the known Merovingian timeline to be coincidence. A daughter, often unnamed or given a variant name, is recorded marrying into a ducal family. A son disappears from monastic roles, only to reappear in civic records under a new title. These transitions are carefully orchestrated, silent moves ensuring the lineage endured without drawing attention. Among these examples, the Glimad family of Aquitaine stands out. By the 9th century, they held lands, produced bishops, and even married into higher nobility. Within private family records, some of which survived only because they were hidden in church chests or private libraries, traces of Merovingian ancestry can be discerned. Though official documents omit these connections, family letters, wills, and coats of arms hint at a deliberate preservation strategy. One parchment, now in a private collection, references a child of light hidden among the vines, which genealogists speculate refers to a Merovingian descendant, secreted away in the family estate. Similarly, across the Rhine, the Egaling family in Bavaria presents another puzzle. Their 11th century manuscripts speak of a queen exiled by treachery, whose progeny were married into emerging noble houses. While the Merovingians are never directly named, the timeline and context align with historical events following Pepin's consolidation of power. Scholars note that these references, though cryptic, suggest a pattern of quiet assimilation, a deliberate folding of the bloodline into socially safer and politically loyal families. Heraldry further reinforces this theory. Families suspected of carrying Merovingian blood often display subtle symbols: bees, intertwined vines, 8-pointed stars, and unusual crosses. These motifs, while decorative at first glance, occur with striking consistency across centuries and regions. The bee, for instance, associated with resurrection and divine kingship, appears not just in tombs and monuments, but on private seals, signet rings, and estate gates. A gold signet ring in Alsace, adorned with a stylized bee and archaic Latin inscription, matches the designs of known Merovingian graves, its provenance listed only as a family heirloom, its secret purpose implied rather than declared. Monasteries played a critical role in the physical and symbolic preservation of the bloodline. After the Carolingian rise, Merovingian estates were often transferred to the church. Conveniently, these transfers provided cover for maintaining records and housing heirs discreetly. Crypts, hidden chambers, and cloistered rooms allowed the young to be educated, observed, and protected, their noble yet vulnerable status shielded from the prying eyes of political rivals. A child raised in a monastery could learn Latin, study scripture, and be groomed for a future that demanded both piety and discretion. Some scholars argue that this deliberate cloistering ensured the survival of not just the bloodline, but its knowledge, rituals, symbolism, and esoteric teachings that could otherwise have been lost. The marriages that followed were strategically silent. Families intermarried to consolidate wealth, land, and influence while maintaining secrecy regarding the sacred lineage they sheltered. A daughter of Merovingian descent might marry into a minor duchy. A son might be adopted into a banking family, his royal heritage diluted yet preserved in a manner that protected him from political persecution. In this way, the bloodline survived as both a living heritage and a coded symbol, its continuity maintained not through crowns or coronations, but through subtle alliances and careful secrecy. Symbolism remained a vital marker of identity. Heraldic devices, architecture, and even garden layouts were tools of coded communication. The Merovingians had long used symbols to denote authority, divinity, and lineage. Even after their public extinction, these symbols persisted in private estates. Bees, flowers, stars, and unique cross patterns served as quiet reminders to those who understood. They were signs to the initiated, subtle signals that a particular family, a specific estate, or a hidden chamber still carried the sacred heritage. These markers, often overlooked by outsiders, were deliberately designed to be both visible and invisible, legible only to those trained to see them. By the 14th century, these networks had become sophisticated. Families that once posed no immediate threat to political authority were now entrusted with the preservation of something far greater, a sacred bloodline and its associated knowledge. Some descendants entered the clergy, others joined trading and banking networks. Still others were hidden entirely, living under assumed names. Despite the dispersal, the cultural memory of the bloodline persisted, encoded in rituals, private libraries, and family traditions. Even when public chronicles omitted or deliberately erased references, the essence of the Merovingian heritage remained alive in shadows. The interaction with secret societies also evolved during this period. Templar associations, later linked to Rosicrucian and Masonic traditions, suggest an ongoing guardianship of knowledge and lineage. While the Templars themselves were destroyed or scattered under political pressure, the theory posits that their custodial role did not end. Instead, responsibility passed to smaller, less visible groups committed to protecting the bloodline, encoding its secrets and ensuring its survival through centuries of political turbulence. The continuity of symbols, the careful curation of manuscripts, and the careful orchestration of marriages and alliances all point to a long-term, deliberate strategy of preservation. Yet even with this networked strategy, the story remained fragile. Political upheavals, wars, plagues, and inquisitions all threatened to extinguish knowledge and blood alike. Families moved, archives were destroyed, and symbols were deliberately obscured. But in every case, traces endured. Letters, diaries, marginal notes, subtle heraldic cues, and local oral traditions maintained the thread. These surviving fragments provided a continuity of narrative that allowed future generations to piece together, speculate upon, and ultimately revive interest in the bloodline centuries later. As Europe moved toward modernity, the Merovingian story shifted once more, from whispered familial lore to historical investigation, and eventually to literary fascination. Scholars, amateur historians, and novelists alike became detectives, tracing the subtle markers left by centuries of careful concealment. Each discovery, a hidden seal, a cryptic inscription, a misfiled genealogical record, was a piece of a puzzle that linked past to present. While certainty remained elusive, the pattern of survival was increasingly difficult to ignore. By the end of this chapter, it becomes clear that the Merovingian bloodline did not merely disappear, it transformed, adapting to historical pressures, embedding itself in noble houses, and surviving through secrecy, symbolism, and strategic alliances. The story is no longer about kings openly ruling. It is about heirs hidden in plain sight, their legacy preserved through the quiet vigilance of generations. The bloodline, sacred or symbolic, persisted as both history and legend, a thread woven into the very fabric of European nobility, awaiting rediscovery by those who knew where and how to look. Guardians, rituals, and secret societies. As the centuries progressed, the survival of the Merovingian bloodline relied not merely on genealogical camouflage, but on a network of guardians, those sworn to protect the lineage and its associated knowledge. These custodians were not always kings, nor were they always visible to the public eye. Some were cloistered monks, retired knights, or discreet noble families. Others belonged to secret societies whose true purpose remained veiled behind rituals, symbols, and coded hierarchies. The Knights Templar, though officially disbanded in 1312, occupy a central role in these theories. Their sudden downfall, precipitated by King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V, has often been framed as a political and financial maneuver. Yet a closer inspection reveals a more nuanced possibility. The Templars may have been custodians of a sacred secret. Beyond guarding pilgrims or holy sites, they are theorized to have protected individuals, descendants of the Merovingian bloodline, sacred relics, and esoteric knowledge that threatened the authority of Rome. Records of lost ships, confiscated archives, and vanished treasurers hint at operations beyond mere financial control. Within Templar commanderies, inscriptions, iconography, and architectural motifs appear to encode messages comprehensible only to the initiated. The twin rose, the bee, the eight-pointed star, and the stylized cross reappear across multiple locations, from France to Spain. While the symbols may seem decorative, they often occupy deliberate positions in windows, altarpieces, and cloisters, creating a silent language of protection and identification. It is within these coded signals that the Templars may have marked places of refuge, secret passages, and safe houses for those of the bloodline. The Templar network, some scholars suggest, did not die with the public executions and suppression in 1312. Instead, its custodial function transitioned, dispersing into smaller, more discreet organizations that could operate without attracting scrutiny. Rosicrucian orders, emerging in the early 17th century, are frequently cited as one such successor. The Rosicrucians, like the Templars before them, emphasize secrecy, symbolism, and the preservation of hidden knowledge. Their alchemical texts, elaborate rituals, and cryptic manifestos may reflect the continuation of a protective tradition, one devoted less to wealth or political power and more to safeguarding a sacred lineage. Freemasonry, too, enters the picture as a possible inheritor of this secretive mission. Although outwardly concerned with brotherhood, moral philosophy, and civic responsibility, Masonic lodges preserved symbols and rituals that echo Templar and Rosicrucian practices. The careful attention to geometry, sacred numbers, and heraldic devices suggests a continuity of knowledge, a visual and ritual language, encoding truths too dangerous to record openly. In certain lodges, family names tied to Merovingian ancestry appear, often quietly, honored through subtle heraldic cues rather than public acknowledgement. The Priory of Sion, a subject of enduring speculation, claims to have been a more explicit custodian of the bloodline. According to the theory, its members maintain detailed genealogical records, rituals, and coded documents tracking the Merovingian descendants through centuries of upheaval. Whether fully historical or partially fabricated, these claims underscore a persistent belief in the necessity of protection. In this context, the priory is less a political conspiracy and more a continuing expression of the guardianship principle established by the Templars. Rituals formed the backbone of this protective culture. Initiations, symbolic gestures, and encoded prayers were not mere ceremonies. They were practical tools for verification, identification, and preservation. A simple symbol carved in stone or painted on a window could confirm an individual's lineage or allegiance. A cryptic verse in a manuscript could encode vital genealogical information. In a society largely illiterate, symbols were a powerful form of communication, enabling the survival of knowledge across generations while keeping it hidden from those uninitiated. Consider the significance of the bee repeated across Merovingian-linked estates, Templar commanderies, and noble houses. The bee symbolized resurrection, immortality, and divine kingship. Beyond this, it functioned as a marker of continuity, a way for families and societies to identify themselves as custodians. Bees appeared on seals, rings, altars, and tombs, creating a network of signifiers visible only to those who understood their meaning. Similarly, 8 pointed stars, flowers with unusual geometries, and intertwined vines served as layered codes, each element a fragment of the hidden story. Beyond symbols, protective practices involved the careful relocation and sheltering of bloodline members. Children were educated in monasteries, sometimes adopting religious life temporarily to shield them from political or social scrutiny. Adolescents were married into trustworthy families, spreading the lineage without exposing its sacred significance. Estates were divided and merged strategically, lands held under church supervision, and archives scattered to reduce the risk of total loss. This networked strategy of dispersion allowed the bloodline to survive centuries of war, plunder, and dynastic purges. These guardianship practices were not purely practical. They carried a spiritual dimension. The Merovingian bloodline, theorists argue, was sacred not merely by noble blood, but through a divine connection traced back to Christ and Mary Magdalene. Rituals, symbols, and societies functioned as spiritual insurance, ensuring that divine legacy persisted in secret, even when overt power was impossible. In essence, the bloodline survival was both physical and metaphysical, maintained through careful strategy, secrecy, and devotion. Historical gaps, silences in chronicles, and cryptic marginal notes are often interpreted as intentional omissions by those in the know. Scholars note that the very absence of information becomes a form of communication, signaling where the guardians acted to protect lineage and knowledge. Monasteries, private estates, and rural villages became repositories, not just of land and wealth, but of living memory and encoded history. By the late medieval period, the combination of secret societies, coded symbolism, and discrete genealogical management created a robust system of lineage preservation. The Merovingian descendants were dispersed but traceable through careful observation of heraldic patterns, architectural motifs, and surviving manuscripts. Even when public chronicles erased or obscured their existence, the lineage endured in plain sight, hidden behind the conventional facades of noble life. This continuity extended beyond Europe. Some custodians may have moved with descendants to regions less susceptible to scrutiny, Portugal, Scotland, and even the Holy Land, where Templar networks, mercantile connections, and ecclesiastical ties allowed for discreet protection. Symbols persisted in local heraldry, church carvings, and estate designs, creating a covert cartography of guardianship that could be read across generations by those initiated into the secret knowledge. Ultimately, the survival of the Merovingian bloodline is inseparable from the societies, rituals, and symbols that protected it. It was not enough for descendants to exist. They required a framework of secrecy, vigilance, and encoded communication. Templars, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and possibly the Priory of Sion all played a role in this complex custodial network, ensuring that the lineage endured despite political upheaval, war, and religious suppression. Chapter 9 closes with a vision of continuity, a web of guardians and symbols spanning centuries, quietly ensuring that the Merovingian bloodline survived under new names, in new houses, and through ritualized secrecy. Each bee, each star, each hidden cross is not a mere ornament, but a marker of endurance, a signal to those who know where and how to look. The bloodline, sacred and hidden, persists not through crowns, but through vigilance, ritual, and the tireless dedication of its unseen custodians. Rennes-le-Château and modern custodians. Nestled among the rolling hills of southern France lies Rennes-le-Château, a village that seems ordinary to the casual visitor, yet conceals layers of history few dare to uncover. With fewer than 100 residents, winding cobblestone streets, and a modest church perched at its center, the village is unassuming. But its association with the Merovingian bloodline, secret custodians, and cryptic symbols has made it a focal point for historians, conspiracy theorists, and seekers of the extraordinary. At the heart of this story is Father Behringer Saunière, appointed to the village parish in 1885. Sonier inherited a crumbling church dedicated to Mary Magdalene and, over the following decades, transformed it in ways that astonished contemporaries. Frescoes were restored, statues erected, and gardens landscaped with peculiar symmetry. Yet what truly captured attention was Sonier's sudden access to considerable funds, allowing him to undertake renovations far beyond the parish's modest means. Where these resources came from he never explained, but rumors abounded. Some whispered of treasures hidden by the Templars, others of secret documents or genealogies, proving the survival of the sacred bloodline. Sonier's work at the church, named Tour Magdala after Mary Magdalene's hometown, was more than restoration. It was cryptic testimony. Statues and paintings were carefully curated, their placement deliberate. One painting depicted the crucifixion with unusual omissions. The wounds of Christ were subtly understated, and a woman with red hair stood unusually prominent, drawing the observer's attention. Scholars and visitors began to speculate, was this a coded reference to Magdalene herself, or even to the bloodline she might have carried? The church's grounds also became a canvas for symbolic architecture. Inverted inscriptions, geometric alignments, and gardens arranged with precise symbolism suggested that Rennes-le-Château was designed to preserve knowledge rather than wealth. Each bee carved in stone, each stylized flower, each cryptic Latin phrase appeared to signal hidden truths. The most famous inscription above the entrance, Terribus, could be interpreted as terrible or awe-inspiring, a deliberate ambiguity that reflected the dual nature of the knowledge preserved within. After Sonier's death in 1917, the village became a magnet for occultists, historians, treasure hunters, and seekers of forbidden knowledge. Some sought gold, others the lost artifacts of the Templars, but the most persistent theory involved the Merovingian bloodline itself. Could it be that Sonier had uncovered documents or relics confirming the survival of Christ's descendants through Mary Magdalene? If so, his sudden wealth and secrecy might have been less about personal gain and more about protection and guardianship. By the mid-20th century, the story of Rennes-le-Château and Sonier had been revived through books and articles, most notably Gerard Dede's work, which linked the village to the Priory of Sion and broader theories of sacred bloodlines. Dede's writings, along with the sensationalist accounts that followed, transformed Rennes-le-Château into a symbolic waypoint, a sacred locus connecting Merovingian lineage, Templar guardianship, and Magdalene mythology. Dan Brown would later fictionalize many of these ideas, embedding the village into a global pop cultural imagination, but for researchers and locals, the anomalies persisted in reality. Modern investigations reveal a village layered with historical, genealogical, and architectural riddles. Parish records show unusual entries, names appearing briefly then disappearing, lands transferred under curious conditions, references to local families tied through marriage to distant noble houses. Many of these families maintain traditions quietly, their symbols echoing centuries-old codes. Bees, stars, flowers, and stylized crosses recur in heraldry and estate markers, often unchanged for generations. These patterns are subtle, but once noticed, they suggest a continuity of custodianship, a hidden network dedicated to preserving both lineage and memory. Even today, descendants of these families sometimes hold clues to a story the public cannot fully access. Estates once owned by Merovingian-linked families contain relics, ornamental rings, combs, or manuscripts, passed down with strict instructions not to discuss their origins. It is a tradition of discretion rather than denial. The bloodline survives quietly, shielded from exposure, embedded in culture, and hidden in plain sight. The spiritual dimension of Rennes-le-Château cannot be ignored. The village, its church, and surrounding estates seem aligned with principles of sacred geometry, a symbolic order linking earthly structures to metaphysical truths. Whether these alignments are deliberate or coincidental remains debated, yet they contribute to the sense of intentionality that pervades the custodial narrative. Maps, overlaid with Templar routes, medieval pilgrimage paths, and ancient land grants, reveal alignments that suggest the movement and protection of a sacred lineage over centuries. Local legends perpetuate the mystery. Villagers recount monks wandering at night, crypts sealed with wax, chests carried under moonlight, and coded carvings on church columns. Skeptics dismiss these tales as folklore, inventions of a 20th century imagination inflamed by books and tourism. Yet even skeptics cannot explain the precise symbolism, architectural anomalies, and recurring motifs, details too consistent to be coincidental. Whether by intent, memory, or tradition, the village preserves traces of something deeply significant, something rooted in both myth and history. The symbolic network extends beyond the village itself. Heraldic patterns in noble houses across southern France and northern Italy reveal hidden consistencies with Merovingian iconography. Stars beneath crowns, forks in lion tails, diagonal slashes denoting bloodlines, all appear in estates that, on the surface, claim no direct connection to the ancient dynasty. The repetition of these symbols suggests a form of covert communication, a way to identify allies and protectors of the sacred lineage without attracting scrutiny. Rennes-le-Château exemplifies how the custodianship of sacred bloodlines adapted to the modern era. Gone are the overt crowns, long-headed kings, and public rituals. In their place are subtle markers, private libraries, secret archives, symbolic gardens, coded inscriptions, and vigilant families who understand the legacy they carry. The narrative shifts from open monarchy to concealed guardianship, from political power to hidden spiritual and symbolic authority. Even now, questions linger. Who, precisely, controls this custodial network? How far has the lineage spread? How much of what Sonier preserves survives intact? Scholars and enthusiasts have traced patterns across Europe, noting recurring symbols, anomalous architecture, and cryptic documents. Yet each answer uncovers more questions, revealing a web of secrecy and continuity that defies simple explanation. Ultimately, the story of Rennes-le-Château is not just about geography or architecture. It is about continuity, discretion, and resilience. The village, like the Merovingian bloodline itself, has survived through adaptation, subtlety, and devotion. Custodianship has passed from Templars to clandestine families, from secret societies to modern scholars and protectors, always maintaining the core purpose: to preserve a legacy deemed too dangerous, too sacred, or too revolutionary to be known publicly. In closing, the village of Rennes-le-Château serves as a living testament to the endurance of secrets, blending history, myth, and coded symbolism. The Merovingian bloodline may not reign publicly, but it persists, hidden yet detectable, like a thread woven through the fabric of Europe's noble houses, sacred sites, and secret societies. Its survival, ensured through centuries of careful guardianship, invites both fascination and skepticism. The story, as it unfolds, leaves the reader suspended between legend and truth, a reminder that some mysteries endure precisely because they are guarded so diligently.